Rethinking the Oriental Carpet in Early Renaissance Paintings. Segment 7, Conclusions. This is the last lecture in this series, where I've used some unusual methods such as demographic evidence, historical context, and the visual record of paintings with carpets themselves to make my case that Eastern Christians resettled in the West during the pre-Ottoman period. I propose that they've brought precious relic carpets with them. These carpets were not luxury items of Muslim manufacture before 1500. And I propose that these relics, some of them depicted in paintings over several centuries, can give us a whole new window onto the early Renaissance. And I've reintroduced the iconographic role of the carpet as holy ground beneath Mother Church that lingers today in the sacramental rituals of the Latin Church. I've reconstructed the contributions of Christian minorities from Asia Minor within Renaissance Europe, the Armenians, the Georgians, and the Greeks, and all of these groups had significant minority populations in present-day Turkey until just before World War I. With all of these indicators of Eastern Christian presence in the early Renaissance, how did we miss that in carpet studies? And why has it taken us so long to see the obvious? To begin to answer this question, I think the Carpet Index magnifies that the crucial mistake of attributing all carpets of every historical period to Muslim origin began at the very inception of carpet studies in the late 19th century. Taking the example of their own times in Victorian-era Germany, when Oriental carpets truly were commercial luxury items of Muslim manufacture, the Berlin School then wrongly extrapolated backwards and declared that this had always been so. This bedrock tenet has been problematic from day one. To be fair, carpet studies began amidst chaos, when the visual and historical record, typified by this ravaged altarpiece by Sassetta, were literally being chopped up and sold off to the highest bidder. With the unification of Italy, churches and monasteries were impelled to support their brethren, and that was when old altarpieces such as this had their panels ripped out of context and widely dispersed to collectors around the world. And the ancient church treasuries of relics, including carpets, were also put on the art market for international collectors. In fact, the collecting of Italian primitives and Oriental carpets became quite the rage among Victorian-era intellectuals. And carpet paintings and altarpieces were dispersed to collections and museums all around the globe, far from their points of origin and totally away from their original context. Modern museums actually are like orphanages, with unrelated objects pressed together, housed and cared for, but stripped of cultural or community context. So this is what carpet studies began with. And it's no wonder that a scholar such as the eminent Wilhelm von Bode was able to collect this dragon carpet fragment, which I think was an actual Armenian relic, that came on the market from a church treasury in Umbria. And he could install this Christian relic as a Muslim artifact in his Museum für Islamische Kunst in Berlin. This was just the beginning. World War I brought the end of the Ottoman Empire, accompanied by the willful destruction of ancient Armenian, Greek, and Syrian communities in emerging Turkey and the Near East. This British World War I propaganda poster by the Dutch artist Louis Remacher is a modern-day adoration of the Magi, painted around 1915. It shows the gifts of Kaiser Wilhelm holding a bomb, the Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph with one of the deadly Krupp cannons, and the Ottoman Sultan Mehmet V bringing his bloody scimitar of genocide. These were gifts of war to a frightened Christ child. Interestingly, early 20th century carpet studies mirrored this conflict, although not in so bloody a fashion. Before the war, one early 20th century specialist, F.R. Martin, tried to question, correct, and broaden the field to include other inhabitants of the Anatolian Plateau, where Armenians and other Christian weavers lived widely in the area of the Armenian highlands that stretched from Persia through eastern Turkey. But Martin was roundly repudiated by nationally biased scholars in Germany and America, who insisted on strict Muslim ownership of the craft. This animosity toward Christian weavers continued after the war, with scholars such as Friedrich Saar in Germany and Arthur Upham Pope in the United States, where Pope in particular was powerful enough a voice in the scholarly community to prevail in excluding the mention of Christian carpet making in the history of the craft. Although historically, it was a fact acknowledged by Arab writers in the 10th century and Marco Polo in the 13th century alike. This denial was just the beginning. World War II destroyed both the European context and the visual record of art. San Bernardino's Osservanza in Siena was bombed to dust in 1944. Europe lost massive amounts of its cultural heritage, and Berlin lost most of von Bode's carpet collection during the bombings of 1943 to 1945. Only fragments and photos of this vast collection remain. By mid-century, scholars were hampered by an incomplete historical record and by nationalistic views, inflamed by international politics. Kurt Erdmann, the German heir to the Berlin School, stepped into the academic breach in the 1960s. And he continued the old tradition. Nevertheless, by the 1970s, old assumptions were being tested against new discoveries in virtually every field of liberal arts. Psychology questioned Freud. Biology looked at the works of Darwin. Archaeology looked at von Schliemann and Arthur Evans. And history reconsidered Edward Gibbons. But carpet studies escaped this reassessment. It stayed tied to Wilhelm von Bode and the Berlin School. There was a glimmer of fresh new thinking in the early 1980s with the founding of the ICOC, the Armenian Rugs Society, and the King and Sullivan exhibition in London. And there was the refreshing work of John Mills in Great Britain, and the pioneering work of Volkmar Ganshorn in Germany, who supported the idea of Christian carpets in Asia Minor. These and other fresh voices were roundly shut down, subdued, and marginalized. We have to ask why. What interfered with this intergenerational reassessment of the Berlin School of Thought? In my opinion, it was three interlinked issues. The first began in the 1950s, when a scholarly bias in a leading authority led to an egregious tampering with sources. These are the words of Kurt Erdmann. Let us take this opportunity to refer once again to Marco Polo's account. Its English translation by Henry Yule is commonly cited and can be rendered as follows. And here he quotes Marco Polo. There are three classes in Turkmenia. The Turkmens live in the mountains and the plains, where they find good grazing lands for their herds. The other two classes are composed of Armenians and Greeks, respectively. They live, and here he interposes, among the Turkomans, in the towns and villages, and are engaged in trade and crafts. And here, he interposes again, which is to say in the towns, the world's best and most beautiful carpets are made. As we see, Marco Polo does not say, as it appears in Yule's translation, that the art of weaving was practiced by the Armenians and the Greeks, but rather that the world's best and most beautiful carpets were made in the towns within the Rum-Seljukian Empire. Of course, this does not exclude the possibility that the weavers were of Greek or Armenian descent in part. It is, in fact, likely. Armenians and Greeks were good craftsmen, always in demand as workers. This, however, was the extent of their importance. Erdmann's egregious tampering with Marco Polo's text and the constant and consistent bias against the Armenian and the Greek carpet weaving tradition that led to it was called out by Volkmar Ganshorn, who matched the alluded text of Marco Polo and Erdmann in his work for all to see. Admittedly, Marco Polo has many translators and translations, but to leave out or interpose your own text with no indications is a serious scholarly sin. Despite this serious flaw, Kurt Erdmann, his students, and their contemporary followers continue to hold a virtual lock over carpet studies even to this day. Why is that? I suggest that the Berlin School of Thought persists today because of two non-scholarly factors. In my opinion, these would be international concerns and deep pocket funding. In the 1970s, just as other disciplines in the West were beginning to reconsider the flaws in their 19th century beginnings, a number of non-European nations began to take an interest in the Berlin School notion that Muslim carpets were depicted in Renaissance paintings. This widespread belief in a Muslim contribution to the art of the Renaissance led to the funding of lavish books in English committed to the old school of thought. This funding is public record and widely acknowledged, and this is a good thing. Because, unlike Erdmann's scholarship problem, this funding is very transparent and a source of pride. However, it's my opinion that this generosity has had a dampening effect on any new or corrective research in carpet studies. And sadly, the same generosity has helped to keep the old myths in place. So I offer the Carpet Index as the beginning of a long overdue correction. Volkmar Ganshorn's pioneering work is now 30 years out of date, and much within it needs to be reconsidered as well. So this series of lectures is my contribution to the beginnings of a new reevaluation within carpet studies. In part, the Carpet Index is intended to be an ongoing reexamination of the entire field. Particularly, the historical context of Oriental carpets in early Renaissance paintings must be reinstated, faced, and resolved. Because in reality, it's an ugly history of religious animosity between both sides. I myself have been tempted to back away from it, but that serves no purpose. In reality, we must face this, that between 1400 and 1530, anti-Muslim feelings were at their height in Europe. Ugly racial stereotypes of Muslims are found in many European paintings before 1500. In 1481, the Turks systematically slaughtered over 800 Christians in Otranto on the boot of Italy. Italian reaction to militant Muslims on their native soil was entirely negative and hateful. This fear and loathing in Europe was compounded by Sultan Mehmet's glee in conquering the major Christian cities of Asia Minor, Constantinople, Trebizond, and Iconium, called the Three Crowns of Mehmet. Mehmet never hesitated to call himself the Sword of Allah, and at that time, and that's their time, I emphasize, not our time, it was perceived as such by friends and foe alike. So we need to face it. The 15th and early 16th century were not a period of kumbaya feeling between religious enemies in the Mediterranean basin. We need to face this ugly history as we bring carpet studies into the 21st century. Can carpet studies be renewed? Yes, I say emphatically, send in the amateurs. And I mean this in the very best way, as I was taught by my old mentor, Marvin Eisenberg, that the love of an object is often what saves it. Carpet studies will be saved by those who love it, not by those who make their living by it. And here I show only a few who typify this. Stefano Ionescu has reported on the carpets in Romanian Protestant churches. Very interesting work. Marco Spallanzani teaches economic history at the University of Florence, and he has done groundbreaking work in the archival materials related to carpets. Onno Edema is a lawyer and professor at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and he too has done groundbreaking work in dating Dutch paintings with Persian and Turkish carpets. And here's my colleague, Pier Antonio Barioli, a retired banker of Venice, who constantly sends me updates and new images to add to the carpet index. These are all amateurs, and they do it for the love of it. I give an enthusiastic shout out to the lively and vigorous and outrageous Turkotech forums. They drive me nuts sometimes, but they are really so full of love for their topic. And here I consider myself in this group of amateurs as an art historian interested in Eastern Christian movement to the West. As an art historian, I offer 3 new concepts to the renewal of carpet studies. First, let's consider the relic carpet in this context of Renaissance art. I want to reclaim the Christian context of Oriental carpets in Renaissance paintings and introduce the concept of the relic carpet in Tuscany and Flanders. Secondly, I want to reassert the obvious sacramental role of the carpet, which continues today as we reclaim the role of the carpet marking holy ground. I've shown you this contemporary Italian wedding on the carpet at San Biagio and Montepulciano in the Sienese countryside. And it appears here too in the recent funeral of Pope John Paul II. Third and finally, I want to introduce the idea of carpets as demographic markers, reclaiming the idea that these carpets represent groups of Eastern Christians resettling in the West. All of those Renaissance paintings of marriage and the family must have led to something. A DNA study from 2005 indicates that up to 10% of Italian males have the unusual G, or Caucasian marker, on their Y chromosome, probably indicating Eastern Christian or at least Caucasian paternity at some time in the past. I offer that Oriental carpets are a new window onto the Renaissance. I think we need to look at them as contributions of brave Eastern Christians, Armenians, Georgians, Greeks, and Syrians, assimilating within and embracing their new environments and becoming major contributors to the life, art, and culture of the early Renaissance in Europe. This is a hidden demographic that needs to be looked at again for its contribution to European history. And I want to thank you for joining me in rethinking the Oriental carpet in Renaissance paintings.